I want to now talk about three very important writers in the 14th century. The first person I'd like to mention is a man named Petrarch, and you can see his dates here. Petrarch in 1348 was named Poet Laureate of Rome, so he was the guy, the poet, the writer in Rome during the time, during the 14th century. He started out as a law student and eventually became a writer. He was very restless. He moved around a lot. He was very, very curious, and he studied and copied the ancient text that had been forgotten in monasteries. One of the interesting things we see with Petrarch is the emergence of Renaissance humanism. Petrarch is very, very concerned with himself and his earthly success and happiness, while at the same time acknowledging the importance of the spiritual world. And this is a tension that we will see in the Renaissance, as Renaissance writers and artists and thinkers begin to turn back to the classical past. They're constantly trying to negotiate the ideas of the classical past, humanism, with their Christianity. So it's an interesting tension that occurs in the Renaissance, and we see it earlier than that in Petrarch, particularly in his work, the Secretum, which just translates as My Secret. And in this work, which are dialogues, Petrarch is having a conversation with Augustine, and he talks about his moral, intellectual, and spiritual deficiencies. And he says that he should be most concerned with spirituality, but he can't deny the importance of the world and its callings on him and his desire to be successful in it. And so these are the tensions you'll see in the Renaissance. How do people reconcile their striving for humanism and human ideals with their religious beliefs? And it was, however, Petrarch's sonnets that made him famous, that led him to become the Poet Laureate of Rome. And most of these sonnets were written for his love, Laura, and she died of the plague. In these sonnets, he praises his love for her, her beauty, or her perfection. And the Petrarchan sonnet now is often referred to as the Italian sonnet, but it's named for him and the way that he set up these love poems to Laura. Now, every sonnet consists of 14 lines. And so what happens, the first 8 lines contains the introduction of the subject. So this would be, all about how Laura and great and wonderful she was. Line 9, you have what's called a turn. And then here the poet is going to take a more enlarged view of the subject. And then the last 6 lines, the poet is going to complicate or deepen the presentation of the subject matter. So the Petrarchan sonnet is basically 8 lines and then 6 lines. Later, Shakespeare will present his own version of a sonnet, still 14 lines, but with a different configuration. Now, Christine de Passan was a female writer during this period of time, and she was born in Venice. She got married at the age 15 to a young nobleman, but 5 years later, her father and her husband died. She was one of Europe's first professional female writers, and she was thoroughly educated in Latin, Italian, and French. She supported herself, her mother, her niece, and her young children, all by her pen. And between 1399 and 1415, she wrote 15 books. So that's almost a book a year. That's pretty fast. Now, One of her most famous books is called the Book of the City Ladies. And this book was about famous women and their virtues. And this was a direct response to a work by another writer who talked about how terrible women were. So Passan got a little upset, and so she decided she was going to write about virtuous women. Another book by Passan that came out a year later that was very popular was called The Treasure of the City Ladies. And this was basically an etiquette book that offered advice to help women survive in society. And she covered the spectrum here. She offered advice to brides, to wives of shopkeepers, to peasants, and even prostitutes, for instance. So she covered the gamut there, and that was a very popular book. Perhaps the writer of the period that you're most familiar with would be Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer was an interesting figure in that he wasn't a professional writer. He lived from 1340 to 1400, and even though he wasn't a professional writer, we know him as the author of the Canterbury Tales. And most likely in high school English classes, the work of Chaucer you read was the Canterbury Tales. And so the next few links after this video is going to give you more information about Chaucer, about the Canterbury Tales, and so I hope you enjoy learning more about him.